April 16 hits, tax day in the United States. But that's not the headline anymore. What actually matters is this. We are now into day 2 of something much bigger, a full-scale American blockade of the Persian Gulf. And if you understand what that really means, you start to see how quickly this situation could spiral. Here's the core of it. Washington has effectively drawn a hard line. Any vessel heading into an Iranian port or leaving one is now considered off-limits. In practical terms, that means U.S. naval forces have positioned themselves to stop, inspect, and if necessary, board ships that try to ignore the restriction. On paper, it's a complete choke point. Day 1? Almost no one tested it. Just a single ship moved through without complying, and the US didn't react. But that doesn't tell us much. First days are always messy. Everyone is watching, waiting, trying to figure out how serious this really is.
But here's where things start to get interesting. For weeks, the conflict has been escalating through strikes and counterstrikes. High-level Iranian figures were targeted and eliminated. On the surface, that sounds decisive, but structurally, it didn't change much. Iran's leadership isn't a single layer, it's a deep bench. When one group is removed, another steps in, especially in a system built around thousands of clerics and power brokers. And when it comes to actual wartime decision-making, the real authority wasn't sitting with politicians anyway. It was concentrated inside the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC. That's where strategy lives. That's where execution happens. The problem is, the IRGC doesn't function like a typical state institution. They're not dependent on taxes or traditional economic systems. Their power is tied directly to revenue streams like oil exports and, just as importantly, smuggling networks. That's their lifeline. So when the US and Israel spent weeks targeting infrastructure and hitting economic assets, it looked impactful, but it barely touched the people actually driving the war. The visible economy took damage, sure, but the core operators, they were still funded, still functioning. Now, this blockade changes that equation, cut off the ports, and suddenly those oil exports, roughly 2 million barrels per day tied to IRGC-linked activity, dropped to zero. At the same time, the flow of incoming goods that feeds their smuggling operations also shuts down. It's not just pressure, it's targeted pressure, aimed exactly where it matters. And here's the twist. It's not even clear if this was the original plan. It almost looks like Washington stumbled into the first strategy that actually hits the right target. That said, just because something looks promising doesn't mean it's going to work. There are still massive unknowns. Will this blockade be enforced consistently? Will it hold long enough to have real impact, or is it more of a political signal than a sustained operation? And then there's the risk factor, because if you push the IRGC hard enough, they don't just absorb the pressure, they respond. These are the same people who control Iran's missile arsenal and drone fleets, and they've proven repeatedly that they can reach targets across the region. Energy infrastructure on the Arab side of the Gulf is especially vulnerable. One coordinated strike and global markets feel it instantly. There's another layer to this that makes the blockade even more significant. Supply chains. Iran doesn't manufacture most of the advanced components it needs for missiles and drones. A huge portion of that comes from China. Throughout the conflict, this created a strange imbalance. Chinese components could still flow in, while Allied shipping faced restrictions in key waterways. Now, that dynamic appears to be reversing. The blockade limits what can reach Iran by sea. It doesn't erase their stockpiles. They already have thousands, possibly tens of thousands of drones ready to deploy. But it slows down replenishment, and over time, that matters. Still, this isn't airtight. There are two critical gaps to watch closely. First, geography. Controlling the Persian Gulf is relatively straightforward. The Strait of Hormuz is narrow, predictable, easy to monitor. A handful of ships can oversee a massive amount of traffic, but Iran has an alternative. The port of Chabahar, sitting further east near the Gulf of Oman. It's outside the immediate choke point. To shut that down, the US would need to stretch its naval presence and effectively run a second blockade. If that doesn't happen, supplies can still come in there and move inland by truck. It's slower, but it works. Second, land routes. You can't blockade borders that aren't water. Northern and eastern Iran remain open corridors. China or anyone else could move goods overland through Pakistan or Central Asia. It's more expensive, it takes longer, but it bypasses the naval pressure entirely. Even so, timing becomes a factor. Moving equipment over land isn't instant. If those routes are activated today, you're looking at roughly 3 weeks before the first shipments arrive. And in a conflict like this, 3 weeks is a lifetime. Alliances shift, strategies change, and situations escalate fast. So while the naval side of this operation is relatively clean and manageable, the broader picture is far more complex. What happens next comes down to a few key signals. Do we see a second phase of negotiations? Does either side show signs of backing down? Or does this turn into a prolonged standoff where both sides dig in deeper, because at this point, a simple declaration of victory isn't really an option anymore. If the US pulls back too early, it risks handing Iran exactly what it's trying to prevent: effective control over the Strait of Hormuz, continued development of its nuclear capabilities, and ongoing influence through proxy groups. That outcome would leave Washington in a weaker position than before this all started, and that reality is starting to sink in, even among political circles that initially supported a more limited approach. The uncomfortable truth is this: there's no clean strategy here, no guaranteed outcome. But if there is a path to forcing Iran to change course, it runs straight through the IRGC's financial and logistical networks. And for the first time since this conflict began, the blockade is the one move that actually targets that pressure point directly.